Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say that I've spent a very bad day and night. I felt like throwing up. I was so upset. I've been watching TV and surfing the net constantly, reading about what's going on. Uh, didn't sleep well. Um, just felt like barfing my brains out. And I've been so upset about this. And I just want to let you know, first of all, the police have lost their minds. They have officially lost their minds. In Minneapolis, there were people standing on their front porches, and the police threw paintballs at them. Paintballs or paint bombs. They sprayed them with paint and yelled, "Light it up," meaning light the paint on fire. Light it up. These were people standing on their porches, on their front porches. A woman who was walking with groceries got hit by a rubber bullet from the police. She was bleeding. Her whole face was completely covered in blood. The blood was trickling down. She said she's not even a protester, and she got hit by a rubber bullet. There have been numerous cases of the police practicing brutality on peaceful protesters, beating them up, wrangling them, throwing smoke bombs and tear gas to break up peaceful protests. Even like in Dallas at the Capitol building or wherever it was, maybe it was City Hall, they threw tear gas at peaceful protesters that were just standing there. They've thrown tear gas and smoke bombs at several people in Denver. It was just a couple minutes after the 8 o'clock curfew had passed, they began throwing tear gas and smoke bombs at the crowd. The police, they're just like a brotherhood, right? They're the fraternity of police, the fraternal order of police. That they're a brotherhood, not a sisterhood, brotherhood, patriarchal. And they all love each other and they all support each other. And when one of their cops is down, they all jump in. It's just like what African Americans say, when one of us is down, we all jump in. And the police are the same way. They all jump in when they feel that one of their own is under threat or being prosecuted or being charged with murder. They all jump in and gang up on protesters. So the police have lost their minds. They've lost their marbles. And they're attacking ordinary citizens, people who aren't protesters, people who have nothing to do with it, and peaceful protesters. They're brutalizing them. So it really is not very safe out there. You may not care about safety, and it might not mean anything to you. You might wear it as a badge of honor. And I just want to say I love you guys. I love everyone who's protesting. I admire you and I commend you. I know that you're putting your own personal lives at risk by facing COVID-19 out there, and that there's a risk of catching it when you're in a crowd, and you're really brave to be out there, because you could catch it and you could die. But and of course discretion is the better part of valor. One could argue that there's a chance that you'll spread it around, that you'll catch it and give it to other people by being out there at those protests. But it is really brave to be able to, even with masks, to be able to stand in a crowd during this epidemic. The governor of Minnesota is afraid that COVID-19 will spread because of these crowds, but that hasn't deterred the crowds even one bit. They're still out there. Now I wanna make another correction. The Mayor Jacob Frey the mayor of Minneapolis, Melvin Carter of St. Paul, and Governor Tim Walz all claimed that most of the protesters were from out of state. Melvin Carter claimed they were all out of state people. Governor Tim Walz claimed that 80% were from out of state. And the Mayor Jacob Frey said something similar. He said most of them are outsiders to our great city and outside of our region, and that they're trying to destroy everything we've spent decades trying to build. Well, they all had to eat their words because some other news organizations, including ones like Care 11 News, that were neutral, that are sort of in neutral territory and not conservative or conservative leaning one way or another. Now Fox News immediately repudiated it and said that 86% were from in-state, and they claimed that none, zero, zilch far-right organizations were involved, which was also untrue. So Fox News basically lied, but and they would lie because they pander to their base, right? They always accuse other people of false news, but they're guilty of false news. But Care 11 said that they were mostly from in-state, that they were mostly locals and people that lived in Minneapolis. So Melvin Carter had to issue a retraction. The governor and Frey have not issued any retractions or taken back their words. They want to just leave people with the impression or the sentiment, because sentiment is so important to politicians, that most of the people were from out of state. But the truth is somewhere in between. Like, there's some people from out of state, most of them are from in-state, and some of them are far right because they saw people with bumper stickers that were white supremacists that had and there's anarchists, like I said that there were anarchists. There were some anarchists. I know anarchists very well. I have a lot of experience with anarchy and anarchists, and I know what anarchists want, what they do, and how they think. So I'm pretty familiar with anarchy, and they often show up and take advantage of situations like this, and they dress like a teenager so they can blend right into the crowd. They're very sneaky. They're very devious. So there were anarchists, there were white supremacists, and there were a lot of people in the state. Now I just want to make a comment here. A representative, a person from Black Lives Matter, who was a Muslim man, he was an African American man, made a statement today on the news. And he was basically saying that in his religion, in Islam, that they teach that a building, bricks and mortar, are not worth even one drop of human blood. Not worth even one drop of human blood. Because, and this is it, they may destroy buildings, but they aren't worth George Floyd's life, and George Floyd's life was taken and his blood was shed, and so that justifies destroying any building at all. Well, I'm going to call BS on this. Not saying that he isn't right about the brick and mortar not being worth even one drop of human blood. Not without questioning that, I will say that with it throughout human history, people have fought over territory, and they've shed tons of human blood over brick and mortar, over land, over territory, and including Muslims. So that's not going to fly. People, it's just what people value, right? It's not what God or goddess decrees. It's what humans value down here on earth, because really there is no God coming out of the clouds, booming with their voice, telling us what we should believe or what we should do or what we should value. It's just what humans value, right? Humans have not valued human blood more than brick and mortar, including Muslims. So that doesn't fly. It may be true, but it doesn't fly as far as experience goes, as far as what people value or not. People do not value. And so, because we know what people do and don't value, then we can make a assessment of how people will react to these brick and mortar establishments being destroyed. And we can assess how they will react. And the way they'll react is by shedding more blood. So these brick and mortar establishments really are worth human blood. Because if they're destroyed, people will react by shedding more blood. That's just a simple fact of life. They will react by shedding more blood. So these brick and mortar establishments are worth human blood, and they are valuable because human lives will be taken because of the destruction of these brick and mortar establishments. I know it sounds goofy and it doesn't sound right, but when have people ever been right? Right? When have people ever done the right thing? Right? They don't. They don't. They have a knee-jerk reaction and they react. And another thing is, how are people living their lives? It's not just shedding of blood and whether a person lives or dies. It's also how people are living their lives. And destroying these businesses lowers their quality of life because they don't have anywhere to shop, first of all, and they don't have anywhere to work, second of all, and third of all, they see these empty shells, and fourth of all, the business owners' livelihoods have been destroyed, and people care about that. So the quality of life goes down for everyone when you destroy these brick and mortar establishments, and it affects the way people vote, and it affects the way people behave and what their philosophy of life becomes. So I would argue that it's more than just an issue of whether a person lives or dies, but how they're living their lives and what the quality of life is for the survivors. And the quality of life for the survivors has gone down. Now, to get to the issue of Black Lives Matter and their core philosophy. Now, I will be the first to admit, I just want to preface this by saying that Black Lives Matter is the only group out there that actually cares about Black lives. I mean, the NAACP has been around for years and years, but they really haven't done a lot. I mean, you don't hear about the NAACP in the news. You don't hear about them protesting in the news. You don't hear about them making making sometimes they make statements. Very rarely they make statements and it makes it to the news. But you just don't hear about them in the news. The NAACP hasn't done a whole lot for Black lives, specifically. The ACLU has defended people legally, but they haven't protested the loss of Black lives. The Southern Law Poverty Center watches hate groups, and I'm sure they've done a lot for Black lives, but they haven't specifically protested the loss of Black lives. You don't see them on street corners with bullhorns shouting about Black lives. So really, if you care about Black lives Matter is the only group that's really out there that's doing anything for Black lives and to try to help with this issue. Now, that being said, there's a reason why I haven't joined Black Lives Matter sooner, and why I've been reticent to join them, and that is destruction of property, and destruction of businesses, and destruction of livelihoods, the looting, the property destruction, the graffiti and smashing of windows, the fires. And the leader of Black Lives Matter, if you can call him a leader, because they have many leaders, they're sort of a decentralized group. But one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter made a statement recently. He did an interview, and he was basically saying that rioting is the voice of the unheard, and that people really have a right, when there's blood being shed, when there's lives being lost, to destroy buildings and to set fires and to loot. That's all justified by the loss of human life. But on the other side, you could say that it'll cause more human lives to be lost by doing these things. Because people are mad. They're so mad. They're so angry about what's going on. And they just feel like throwing up, like I did last night. And they're so sick. It makes them sick thinking about these businesses being destroyed. And it's going to cause more racism. And not just racism, but also political agenda. It's going to shape their politics and make them hate. It breeds hate of liberals and Democrats in general. And it's going to advance a conservative agenda in our society, a conservative agenda in America. And you don't believe me? You don't think it's going to cause more blood to be shed, more Black lives to be lost? It will. It will. Trust me, the destruction of property will make people hate liberals, hate Black people. It'll breed hate. And so these businesses really are worth lives, because it makes people so angry, where conservatives or small business owners, when they hear about this destruction of property and this loss of lives. Now, as to the central philosophy, be summed up of Black Lives Matter, it can be summed up in two words: systemic racism. And this last semester I've learned a lot more about systemic racism. I learned about it from my professor, who's quite liberal and quite radical, and she selected several books on the subject of systemic racism for us to read. So I've heard about systemic racism several times during this last semester, and I'm more familiar with it now. Not saying I'm an expert, not representing myself as an expert on systemic racism, but I know more about it now. And basically, systemic racism says that in both both in laws and in our society as a whole. As a whole, it's a holistic view. There's racism enshrined in our laws and in our society and in our institutions. But now we're seeing the fruits of that philosophy. Now we're seeing the fruits of that philosophy, and that fruit is the destruction of businesses, especially small businesses, and destruction of property. Now, how could that be? How could that be? How does that follow from that? Well, I'll try to explain it. First of all, there's things like discrimination in employment practices. That's one thing that might apply to small business. Discrimination in hiring practices. Another thing is when there's confrontations with thieves. Thieves come into a business and steal things, and then the business owner calls the police, and it causes friction between the business owner and the thief, and causes them to say that was a form of systemic racism, that they called the police because they stole. And a third thing that might be a form of systemic racism is when they may discriminate against a customer, or not give them the same kind of treatment, or not give them the same kind of care or attention that they would give, like, say, to a white customer. So there's a few things. That businesses, and especially small businesses in general, could be accused of potentially. Oh, and there's also the profit motive. The profit motive is another accusation. That small businesses could be accused of being a part of systemic racism. So there's that, and also it's been harder for, just as a side note, it's been harder for minorities to start businesses because they can't get the loans. No one will sell a business to them. They don't want to sell their land or their business or rent a space to a minority business owner. And so they're kept out of certain areas where they can't start a business. And they may not be able to start a business at all because they can't get the loans to start a business. So there's a few things that apply to minority business owners in particular, specifically. But I just want to focus on what small businesses might do that might be considered systemic racism. Now, as far as systemic racism as a whole, I would argue, that they're arguing that it's an institution, that racism is an institution in our society. Now, systemic racism, we know, existed in the past. It was very clear-cut. We had the institution of slavery. That was the first institution we had in America, was slavery. Then we had lynchings, and we had institutionalized in our laws separate but equal, where we had the buses, the lunch counters, the drinking fountains, the movie theaters, everything separate, okay? Black people had to stay away from white people. Black people had their own drinking fountain. Black people had to go to the back of the bus. Black people had to have their own lunch counter. So there was institutionalized racism for sure. Now the real question is racism now enshrined in our laws? Well, it's not supposed to be. But one example they gave, which may be a biggie for some people, is the way that crack cocaine is prosecuted much more strictly than ordinary cocaine. And that may be because they instituted the law not because they were racist, but because crack cocaine is much more addictive than regular cocaine and much more deleterious in its effects. So it's a much worse drug. Crack is a much worse drug than regular cocaine. But people were claiming that because it was mostly African Americans who sold crack cocaine, that they were prosecuted much more strictly and much more often than white people selling ordinary cocaine, and therefore it was a form of racism. This law was a form of systemic racism. I'm not sure if that's really true. People were more concerned about how serious the drug was, how addictive the drug was, and how destructive the drug was of life. But it's true that in practice it's been a racist law. But that's one example. Okay, that's just one example. Another example, now all the rest of these examples aren't really enshrined in our laws. So they can't really be considered institutionalized racism, but they're examples of social racism. In other words, society's racism. That black people are arrested 3.7 times more often for marijuana possession or using marijuana than white people are. And when they do get arrested, they're punished much more harshly for possession of marijuana. That's one thing. There's some other examples. Redlining is one for years. Like even today, banks guide black people towards subprime loans, which are basically junk loans, and also toward loans with variable rates of interest, which means that the interest rate could shoot way up and they might not be able to make their payments. They're guided toward bad loans that they can't pay off. And they're guided toward rundown, degenerate neighborhoods where no one really wants to live. They just look bad. To just be honest with you, these neighborhoods look bad. They've got graffiti everywhere. They've got a high crime rate. They're segregated. They're mostly minorities live there, and they're guided toward those neighborhoods. So there's redlining. This is the idea behind systemic racism, that it's society as a whole and our culture and our institutions that are racist. But I would argue that society is made up of a lot of individuals. A lot of little individuals. Each one of them has free will. Each one of them has a free will choice to make their decisions. And they are racist individuals. So society is only the sum of its parts. And people who argue for this group racism, ignore or tend to ignore or just to elevate their theory. They tend to play down or diminish the contributions of an individual to racism. But when you have hiring practices where people are being discriminated against because they have black sounding names and they get called 50% less, That's individual racism, because those hiring recruiters are practicing racism. They are practicing racism directly. It's not because their institution told them to. It's not because their employer told them, okay, don't hire people with black names. It's their own prejudiced. Another example, how could this have happened to George Floyd in a town with the most liberal mayor ever, a very liberal governor, and a very liberal and African American police chief? How could this have happened? Is it because of our laws or the way that people have been trained? Is it systemic racism at work? No, it's not the system. It's the individuals. No matter how well they're trained, no matter how much training they got, and they got a ton of training. They just got a ton of training. Sensitivity training courses, teaching people about race and how to identify mental illness in minorities, and how to de-escalate a situation, and how to be gentle when you tackle someone, and how to be careful of people's lives. That didn't change that officer one bit. So it wasn't systemic racism, it was individual racism at work. But what does Black Lives Matter do? They go right back to systemic racism. Does that make any sense? I don't think so. And here's the real question. How did these small businesses that are all being gutted contribute to George Floyd's death? They didn't. Now maybe a professor or a member of Black Lives Matter or someone sitting in a high position somewhere is smarter than me. Okay, maybe they are super hyper geniuses, or maybe they've seen something I haven't and they have more experience. Maybe they're smarter, maybe they have more experience, maybe they know something that I don't. But I just don't see it. I'm sorry, but I don't see it. And if I don't see it, and I'm liberal, then what is white America thinking? What do white people think if they're not smart enough to figure out what systemic racism is? Now, it's kind of interesting. Someone promoting the idea of systemic racism now is Ben & Jerry's. And Ben & Jerry's is owned by Unilever, which you wouldn't even think that Unilever would have anything to do with the subject matter of systemic racism. But Ben & Jerry's is now arguing in favor of systemic racism, the concept of systemic racism, and saying, yes, this is a real thing, and giving examples like I gave before of systemic racism. And of course, systemic racism is a big deal in Australia because of the way Aborigines are treated, which really is an example of systemic racism. There really is systemic racism there. But I would argue that specifically in the case of George Floyd, that these businesses that didn't have anything to do with George Floyd's murder directly, in other words, all the businesses other than Cup Foods, not Cub Foods, but Cup Foods, had nothing to do with George Floyd's death, and they do not deserve to be burned. Now, here's some of the arguments I've heard from some of the Black Lives Matter and some of the protesters. One of them said, well, the people of Minnie, meaning Minneapolis, M-I-N-N-Y, the people of Minnie are starving to death. They're starving to death and have been for years. And these businesses that are nearby have been starving them. So they really deserved what they got. I take issue with this because if people are starving for years, they generally wind up dead. So how could people be starving for years and still be alive? I would argue that no one is really starving. Like if you see the residents of the area, they all tend toward obesity. I don't think they're starving. Maybe malnourished. Like maybe they're not getting enough micronutrients or enough protein, but they're not starving to death. Another argument that I heard was, when one young African American man said, "These businesses have been profiting off of us for years." Well, duh. That's what businesses do. And if you don't know what a business does, I'll explain it. First of all, businesses want to make a profit. That's their motive. Their motive is a profit motive primarily. If they don't have a profit motive, they don't stay in business at all. They just fail. So many businesses fail. 90% of all businesses fail. If they don't primarily have a profit motive, they don't stick around for you to enjoy their business. So they have to have a profit motive. They have to think about their bottom line. So every business has a profit motive. They have to stay in business. So what do businesses provide? Businesses work hard, and the business owners work hard. They work 16-hour days. They work 6 days a week, some of them 7. They work hard. Why do they work hard? They work hard for profits. And what kind of hard work do they do? Well, they provide a service. And they provide services and goods. They provide goods and services to the public. They work hard to provide these goods and services to the public. And then their payoff, what they get in return, is profits. And they wouldn't even go into business if they didn't think, because of opportunity costs. They wouldn't go into business if they could make more money doing a job somewhere. If they could work for, say, Wells Fargo and make more money, they wouldn't go into business. So there has to be a significant profit, and they have to be getting a significant amount of money. Not just an accounting profit, but an economic profit. And eventually all businesses trend towards zero economic profit. So that's another thing that holds businesses back. They can't stay in business too long unless they retool, revamp, rebrand, change their products slightly, or a lot, change their products a lot, unless they change their menu, remodel, change their environment, change their storefront every few years. They don't stay in business for long because they lose their economic edge. They lose their economic profit. The economic profit trends towards zero, which is a normal profit. And that doesn't mean they have no profit. It just means that they're not making more than they would doing something else. So business owners work hard for minimal compensation in most cases. Constantly have to revamp and retool and look better than their competitors. They're competing with other businesses. And they provide goods and services to the public. And maybe they're starving some people, but at the same time they're providing jobs and wages. And what is the motive of the employee? The motive of the employee is the wages, right? They're not serving you for their health. They're not volunteers. They're not feeding the homeless or feeding people who are needy. They're working for wages, right? That's what they do it for, is the wages. They work hard for their wages. Their businesses are not there. They're there to serve you, but they're not there to serve you for free. And there's very few things in this life that we get for free. There aren't very many free lunches. And where there are free lunches, they're for people who are economically disadvantaged and too poor to afford. These businesses, I would argue, even if these, especially minority-owned businesses, even if they do not provide goods and services to the locals, like even if their target customer is from the suburbs or outside of the city, even if they're not providing goods and services to the people who live there, they're not really starving them because they provide jobs to the people who live there. And in turn, the people who live there that get the wages from those jobs can use that money to buy food elsewhere. So they're really not starving people at all. They're actually feeding people. So they're not feeding everyone because each business can only hire a limited number of people. But if you work more than one job, or if there's other businesses. So they do, as a whole, collectively, they provide enough jobs for most of the people who live in that area. Some people will have to work downtown. So I would argue, like, here's what they provide. They provide goods and services, they provide wages, they provide jobs, and then they get profits, and then the people who get the profits spend the money in the community. So it's a circular thing. When you destroy a business, no more goods and services, no more jobs, no more wages, no more profit, and an eyesore, a blight on the community, a blight on the landscape. And everyone loses. Society as a whole is worse off, as my economics professor would say. So who are you really helping by destroying a business? Well, you're bringing the system down, you're hurting the government, and you're creating lawlessness so that there won't be any more police, and there won't be any more, if you destroy a business, there won't be any more cops, and there won't be any, and if you burn down a police precinct, there won't be any more cops, and there won't be any more people paying taxes, and there'll be lawlessness and disorder, and society will collapse, and everything will be groovy then. Then anarchy rules, and society as a whole will be better off for the destruction of society. Right? I mean, that's what anarchists believe, right? That they're doing society a favor by destroying society, saving it from itself. I don't buy that. And I don't buy that destroying a business is going to bring down society. May make society worse off, but it's not going to bring down society. It's definitely not going to bring down the government. It's not going to affect taxes, because the only two things we can be sure of are death and taxes. So there won't be fewer taxes or no taxes at all. There won't be fewer government officials. There won't be fewer police. It won't bring society down. It just brings the business down and the community that lives near the business down. And let's do a fact check, shall we? Let's do a fact check. We saw during this rioting, 90% or greater of the crowds were white people, and they were looting and spraying graffiti and smashing windows and burning in a black neighborhood, or a predominantly minority inhabited neighborhood. And it's so bad now that there's also going to be not just white flight, but there's going to be black flight. We're going to have African Americans and Mexican Americans and Asians and all sorts of people moving out of those neighborhoods. It'll become like Detroit, which is a ghost town, right? Everyone will move farther out to the suburbs, because of the destruction, and Minneapolis will become more like Detroit. It'll become a ghost town. So that is a sad, sad result of what these white people are doing. Here's another question. Here's another argument that I heard. Well, if you argue against or oppose rioting, if you oppose burning, if you oppose looting, if you oppose property damage, then you are no better than an oppressor. You are colluding. That was the word, colluding with the oppressors in our society. You are an oppressor yourself. Now, this is a rather extreme point of view, wouldn't you say? Wouldn't you say that that's extreme? Like, wouldn't you say that that's sort of far left, a far leftist point of view? And like I used to hear an argument, when you go far enough left, you're right. So far left, you're right. Or where left meets right, which is extremism. Why is this an extreme point of view? Well, for those of you who are youth and don't have a lot of experience and don't know, Martin Luther King Jr., with his I Have a Dream speech, he argued that people should protest peacefully, that they should not loot, that they should not burn. Does that make Martin Luther King Jr. now an oppressor? And here's the real question. When do these rioters cross the line into becoming oppressors themselves? Is that possible? Is that even possible for someone whose cause is righteous to cross the line and become an oppressor themselves? Well, like my friend Judy said, they cross the line and become oppressors themselves when they target an innocent business that had nothing to do with the death of George Floyd. And wouldn't that be every business other than Cup Foods? You could argue that with systemic racism, like a lot of people who hear about a systemic racism, this is the fruit of the theory of systemic racism, is shouting, "It's the system! It's the system! Bring down the system! All these small businesses are part of the system! Bring down the system!" That's the fruit of their philosophy, which isn't pretty. It's not nice at all. So, is there such a thing as an individual? Are individuals worthy of consideration, and are individuals racist, and can we take individuals into account? Well, sure we can. Sure we can. There's nothing preventing us from taking individuals or individual wrongs into account, and there's nothing wrong with pointing out that a system is no better than the individuals that comprise it. That individuals who comprise a system form the basis of the society. Society is comprised of individuals, and society is nothing more than the sum of its individuals. We're all individuals. I mean, you can't hop into my body. I mean, I know that makes a fun plot, right? A fun plot point in a sitcom or a drama, to hop into somebody's body, but you can't hop into my body. You can't control my brain. You can't control my decision. You can't control what I do. People are pretty darn isolated inside of their bodies, inside of themselves, and they do have selfhood. So this collective philosophy, not only does it fall flat in many aspects, but it also creates an atmosphere of hostility, of finger pointing, of blaming, of even of racism, like you white people. That could be considered racist. Or, although that's mostly my mom's concern. My mom is very concerned about you white people. She says that all the time, and she's really concerned with reverse discrimination, which happens less often. Sometimes white people discriminate against white people because they're white. But you don't see black people discriminating against whites very often. It does happen, but it doesn't happen often. It happened with a black doctor I went to once. He said he'd give me something dirt cheap. And I got sick from what he gave me. I was allergic or had a sensitivity. So I was very unhappy with him saying he would give me something dirt cheap. It was actually a sulfa drug. But, it can happen. Reverse discrimination can happen. It doesn't happen very often. But finger pointing and blaming these businesses, specifically minority-owned businesses that are being destroyed by white people, is beyond the pale. That's just far out there. That's nuts. That's crazy. And they had nothing to do with the murder of George Floyd, and burning them down isn't going to spare black lives. It's going to hurt black lives, and it's going to make more racists. And it's going to make more people prejudiced against liberals. Now, what about so we do know that the fruits of this philosophy are bad. And, the people on the street didn't invent systemic racism, but it's on everybody's lips. Everybody's mentioning systemic racism, okay? Everybody's talking about it. Everybody wants to talk about it. Even I want to talk about it. And everybody, it's on everybody's lips nowadays. Everybody's interested in systemic racism. And this philosophy came out of Harvard, came out of the major universities. It's a philosophy that came from professors of law, professors of history, and racial studies. It comes from high levels, and they're really smart people. They know a lot. And they know a lot of history. So who are we to argue with such brilliant minds? But, the common person really does not get systemic racism or even know if it's true. Because a lot of people believe in the individual. And they believe in rugged individualism, especially conservatives. One of the bywords of conservatives is rugged individualism. And because they believe in individuals, they don't buy into systemic racism at all, especially since racism is not necessarily enshrined in our laws anymore. So there's a lot of little individuals creating the society we live in and making decisions every day on an individual basis that are causing what we observe as systemic racism. We're saying, yes, it's in our society. Yes, there is what is considered systemic racism, as society as a whole is racist, but it's individuals that make it happen. And where does racism really begin? Does it really begin with the government? Does it really begin with society? I would argue that racism begins in the home. And it begins with little Junior seated on his mother's knee, and his mother telling him stories about black people. That's where racism begins. It begins in the home. And then as the little boy grows up and he goes to school and his teachers are talking, he learns more racism from his teachers. Even when they're well-intentioned, she prejudices him. And then he goes out on the street and he meets little Tommy, who's black, and they have a little fight, and he becomes a little more racist. And then, when he grows up, he encounters black people on the street, and maybe he's an officer by then, and people are throwing bottles at him and calling him pig and calling him names, and he hates them even more. So it begins at home. Racism begins at home. And it's not because of our society anymore. It's not because of our it could be cultural. It could well be cultural, but it's not our laws anymore. It's not enshrined in our laws. It is enshrined in the home. That's where racism primarily comes from nowadays. As far as the current generation goes, I can't speak for the baby boomers. Maybe they remember the lunch counters and think that was a really good idea and wonder why it's not like that anymore. Maybe. But most of the people who are my generation or younger who are alive today, they're racist because it begins in the home. So what can we do about this? What can we do about systemic racism or racism that begins in the home? The problem is there's not a lot we can do other than try to change people's viewpoints so that they don't become racist and don't murder George Floyd or people like him. And I'll tell you one thing. People do not realize that it wasn't African Americans burning these neighborhoods. They don't realize that it was white people from the suburbs. So that's one thing you can do. You can get the word out that white people from the suburbs were burning and looting and pillaging African American neighborhoods. You can get the word out. That's one thing you can do. And it's probably the only thing you can do at this point because there's not much else you can do. But here's another thing. Black Lives Matter, supporting looting, supporting burning, supporting pillaging means that Black Lives Matter, their days are numbered. People aren't going to support them forever. And they may fall by the wayside because their philosophy is tainted with approbation of violence and approbation of extreme means to get attention, including destruction of property. As long as they're supporting destruction of property, destruction of people's livelihoods, destruction of neighborhoods, and destruction in general, people aren't going to support them, and their support will wane. Unfortunately, because they're the only ones who are doing anything about this subject out there. There's a lot of young liberals involved in this. I even know one. I know a young liberal who's involved in this, got mixed up in this, who was taking photographs of burning SUVs that are overturned, they're flipped over and on fire, and hashtagged it, fuck the police. Sorry about that, folks. Fuck the police, fuck the 12, and all sorts of hashtags. Philandro Castile was one of the hashtags. George Floyd was another hashtag. Trayvon Martin was another hashtag. And all sorts of pictures of burning. All the pictures she took were pictures of fires. So she's promoting the worst thing that a rioter can do, and that's burn. So this burning issue and the concept of systemic racism being extended to these small businesses, especially minority-owned businesses. Now, there was another thing. Another friend of mine believes that it was all the acts of white supremacists, that they were the ones doing the burning, all white supremacists. and she there was a call put out to sweep and to clean up broken glass only for minority-owned businesses, specifically African-American owned businesses. And heck with everyone else. If you're white, we're not going to help you. If you're a white business owner, we're not going to help you. We're only helping African-American owned businesses. It's a little bit, I don't know, off-putting, and a little bit, I don't know, it's just, it's not racist specifically, but it's just kind of biased. It's a little bit biased and doesn't breed goodwill at all. I wouldn't want a business there. I wouldn't want to own a business there in that neighborhood, because I know that people won't help me if anything goes wrong because I'm white. So that's another thing. People won't want to rebuild their businesses there if they're white. As far as the issue of white supremacists all being responsible, I'm sure that they enjoyed blending into the crowd, and that they had fun. You know, the young ones had fun setting these fires. It was fun for them. It gave them a thrill. Setting a fire is fun, right? Like when I was 5 years old, I really wanted to light my birthday candles. I wanted to light my birthday candles because it's so much fun setting a fire, right? So they're still young enough that it's fun for them to set a fire, and they get a thrill out of it. And arsonists always get a thrill out of setting fires. Even the arsonists showed up. Just people who are pyromaniacs showed up. So pyromaniacs, white supremacists, far-right groups, alt-right, but also liberals, like white boys from the suburbs that listen to rap music. They showed up to set fires and to smash windows and to spray graffiti. So it was 50-50. Just like our country is split down the middle, 50-50. It was 50% alt-right, 50% liberal, and the rest were pyromaniacs, and they all showed up, and they all dressed as teenagers. And in case you don't know, 76% of all youth use Instagram, and 75% use Snapchat. So do the math. Even if 50% of them are liberals, there's at least 26%, right, that are conservative. So everyone is on these sites. Everyone who's young is on these sites, and they're all communicating constantly, and they're all viewing each other's opinions and viewing each other's posts and each other's handiwork and each other's videos. So they're in constant communication nowadays. They're wired. They're the wired generation, and they know what's going on with each other. They, even with competitors and people that they're opposed to, they know what's going on. So that's how they all showed up. They all knew what was going on. They all knew about the riots, and everyone showed up. Everyone and his brother showed up. People from the suburbs, people from out in the countryside came, people in the city came. Everyone came, including the far right and the far left and people in the middle. They all showed up. Now, during the day, protesters showed up with brooms, and they showed up with plastic garbage bags, and they were protester angels. They were protester angels, and they were cleaning up the neighborhood as they walked along, picking up trash. But then when night fell, all the devils came out and started looting and burning again, under cover of darkness where they wouldn't get caught. And everyone's wearing masks. It's considered acceptable now because of coronavirus. So everyone owns a mask, and people can hide their identities behind a mask. You can wear masks and sunglasses and a baseball hat, and no one knows who they are. So, and it's easy to blend into a crowd that way. You don't stand out wearing a mask anymore. So there's lots of issues. There's lots of things going on. And there's lots of things to think about, a lot of things to consider, whether you agree. You don't have to agree with the philosophy or the philosophy or the viewpoint or the theory of systemic racism if you don't want to, even if you've gone to college and even if it's been shoved down your throat. You don't have to agree. And I really think that these young liberals right now who are very far left are going to shift toward the middle as they get older. They will shift toward the middle. I don't know what their kids will do, but they will definitely shift toward the middle when they see the fallout and the carnage and the fallout from their own actions, and see a building that they burnt down still an empty shell 20 years from now. They're going to think about what they did, and they're not going to think fondly about it. They're not going to remember it with fondness. They're going to hate themselves and loathe themselves, and then they're going to be turned off toward the whole idea of being far left. Some of them might even become conservatives because of this. But what about the business owners? What about the people who live in those neighborhoods, like that disabled black lady in a wheelchair? I think her name was Stephanie, and she was crying because the buses were down. She had nowhere to go. What does she think of the governor right now, or how Mayor Fry handled the situation? No one's satisfied with the liberal governor or Mayor Fry right now. They're very unhappy with them. And the residents that weren't involved in the rioting, and the people who were just peaceful protesters, and the people who were and who believe in peaceful protest, who buy into Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream," and the people who were cleaning up, and the people who live there and also the business owners and the people who work for the business owners, the workers, and the residents of the suburbs. What do they think of Mayor Fry? Will they reelect him? What do they think of Governor Walz's handling of it? Will they reelect him? Maybe not. I think because of this protest, just the way it was handled, the protesting, I think there's going to be a major shift right. That's my prediction. And it's not going to help George Floyd or anyone like him. There's going to be more racists. The racists are going to become hardened because of seeing the rioting. Even if they don't hate black people specifically, they'll blame black people, and they'll blame liberals in general. So they'll hate liberals, and they'll shift farther right. The people who are left, some of them will shift right, and some of them will shift toward the middle or right of middle. Like they'll become swing voters and be more likely to elect a Republican next time. And another thing you'll see is conservative minorities. Okay, for example, Catholics. A lot of Mexicans are Catholics. Catholics tend to be conservative. They're definitely opposed to abortion, and they may shift right and start voting Republican because it didn't take much to push them over there. You'll even see African American conservatives. So you'll see African American conservatives, or are euphemistically called black conservatives. You'll see a lot of them. A lot of business owners will become black conservatives. We have people who are from Africa who aren't African Americans who have lived here for centuries or whose ancestors faced slavery. They're what we say right off the boat, and their opinions haven't been formed yet. They just got here, and they're not familiar with American politics. A lot of them might shift right. They burned an Ethiopian restaurant. They burned a library at 28th and Nicollet. They burned a lot of minority businesses. A lot. And all of those minority businesses have family. And they all have extended family. And they all have people who work for them. All of them might shift right. Not all. Like some will think, well, what will a conservative do to me as a African American individual? They might think about that, but there will be a lot of them shifting right. We'll see a lot more. We'll see a lot more black conservatives, especially Africans from Africa, because they own a lot of the businesses. So we're going to see a shift in this whole country from left to right, and Trump might get reelected because of this, and definitely Walz and Fry will get voted out of office, and we'll have a conservative in there for a while. And because of having a conservative in there for a while, there might be more bloodshed. There might be more racists joining the police force. They might get more lax about their hiring practices and hire some more racists and do nothing about the racists if they do anything bad. So it's going to become a lot worse for African American people, both in Minnesota and throughout the entire nation, and maybe even the entire world, because of these protesters burning these businesses. You wouldn't think so, would you? You wouldn't imagine that would be a consequence. But that's a hard consequence, and it's a practical consequence. It's not theory formed in Harvard. It's a reality. So I just want to leave you with this thought. Support the protesters. Support their efforts. Support liberals. And here's another thing. These liberals, like you think, oh, well, they're liberals. Ooh, they're liberals. They're so lax, and they're so soft, and they're so weak. But Governor Walz called out the National Guard, and he called in over 1,500 National Guard members. Fry was on high alert. He incorporated the National Guard members into his police force and integrated them so that they could work together to quell the crowds. So these liberals do care about the public welfare, and they're not lax, and they're not soft like Trump would like to paint them as. They did make a lot of mistakes, but those were human errors, and it wasn't intentional. It wasn't because they're soft or lax or weak on the protesters. They weren't soft. They were just a little bit dumb and not quite as swift or as sensible as they should have been, but not because they were soft. So liberals aren't necessarily soft, but nobody's satisfied right now with the way they handled things and I think they're not going to stay in office for very long. I think they're going to get voted out of office because everyone's dissatisfied with them. Black Lives Matter has no love of them, of these liberals, because even though they made a swift response, they're not going to reelect them because they're dissatisfied with what happened to George Floyd on their watch. And the people who live there, whose neighborhoods are blighted, aren't satisfied with the way they handled the situation. And people around the state that are all conservatives aren't satisfied with Walz. So I don't think they're going to stay in office very long, which is a real shame because they were very liberal and they had the best chance of getting justice for George Floyd and of preventing something like this from happening again, but they're not going to stick around in office long enough to make any changes. So this is a real problem, just something to think about. Think about the pragmatic and the practical consequences of the philosophy of systemic racism, and the fruits of this philosophy of systemic racism is if burning down businesses and blaming businesses for murder is the best we can do, if that's what systemic racism is all about, and if that's what it means, and if Black Lives Matter continues to support this philosophy of systemic racism and extend it to small businesses and to people's homes and apartments and say you deserve to be rooted out of your homes, of your apartments, of your businesses because you're part of the system and you deserved it. If that's what this is about, then they're going to fail. People will reject them. They'll fall by the wayside. And it's sad because no one else cares, really. No one else cares. Who cares about Black lives? Who really believes Black Lives Matter other than Black Lives Matter? Who's doing anything about it? No one. So it's really sad. Sad that they've chosen this path, but they tend to be... Black Lives Matter isn't going to change because I said so. No way. I'm a white girl, and they're not going to change because of me. They're ultra-liberal, and they're on a ultra-liberal trajectory, ultra-liberal path. They're pretty extreme, and they're not going to change for anyone. What we really need is maybe like a substitute for Black Lives Matter, like, I don't know, you could call it Black Lives Really Matter, or We're All for Black Lives, or something, just something similar, and then have it be based on Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy, and have it be a revival of the civil rights movement. You could even call it civil rights revival or something to that effect, and revive the idea of preserving lives, of preserving livelihoods, of preserving small businesses, and of not blighting the landscape, and of condemning rioting and property destruction, and attacking the police and hostility and throwing bricks. People who are disciplined, people who are peaceful demonstrators, who demonstrate and who peacefully protest. That needs to happen. And it hasn't happened yet. We haven't seen that yet. We've just seen more and more extreme tactics and approbation of the actions of white supremacists by Black Lives Matter because they didn't condemn the burnings of these pyromaniacs and these anarchists and these white supremacists. They didn't condemn what they were doing. It was just any burning, any looting, as long as it was for George Floyd, was okay. Which as I have said during this video, I've called that into question. So I'll just leave you with this thought. Maybe it would be best not to loot or to burn or to vandalize. Um, there are consequences, and it could cost, there could be bloodshed, there could be more racism, there could be black lives lost, and there could be blight on the community and a lower quality of life for African Americans for generations to come. Just something to think about. Young people, if you're listening, your actions today have consequences for other people. You're not hurting yourselves, you're hurting other people. So just think about that, especially young white liberals. So that's it. Think about the businesses. Think about how they help people and how they contribute, what they do contribute to our lives. How they're not necessarily part of systemic racism as we've known it, other than the things that I mentioned, which could happen anywhere and could be based on individual decisions. And individuals, you really can't change individuals. And if you can't change individuals, how are you going to change a whole system, right? It takes time, and it takes people dying. It takes generations to change a whole society, because individuals have to change, and that takes time. One generation has to die off, and another has to replace it, and the young ones have to be raised right. It's very hard to change what happens when Johnny's sitting on his mother's knee, all right? That takes a long time to change. Sometimes it can change in college. Sometimes it can change in high school. Sometimes it can change with education, and that is how it's changed. But it takes time. And there's always going to be that lone individual, like the guy that killed George Floyd, that starts with a C. His name starts with a C. I'm not sure what his name is. Caros or Carus. I don't know what his name is. I'm so bad with names. But it starts in the home. Just take that away from this. It starts in the home. That's where racism starts. It starts with the individual, despite what anyone from Harvard may say. So that's it. Think about what you're going to do next, whether you want to loot and pillage, or whether you want to join an anarchist, or whether you're going to listen to the governor and the mayor and clear the streets at night and protest peacefully for the day. Day or night, your choice, right? Because if you protest at night, you're giving cover to these individuals. You're giving them a crowd to blend into. And then they escape prosecution for these things that they're doing, which sow so much hate and so much discord and increase racism in our society. So think about it. And I'll see you next time.